Hello there, Joe, the CRM chap here. Today we're going to be talking about how you can use Azure Data Factory alongside the Common Data Service to achieve a truly cloud extract, transform, load, or ETL type solution. This is a common term when it comes to data integration and things like that. So first of all, we're going to just quickly cover over who I am, what my background and experience is, and why I want to talk to you today about this. We'll then take a look at the current landscape. So at the moment, if you're wanting to achieve an ETL type requirement with the Common Data Service, what are the current solutions out there and what are some of the limitations that you've got with them? We'll jump in, take a look at what Azure Data Factory is, cover off some of the key benefits and the value that it can sort of deliver when used. Best way then to see it is in action. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a demonstration. We're going to do a complete data migration from an on-premise Dynamics CRM 2013 instance onto CDS. We're going to do that in less than 15 minutes, so no pressure on that. We'll finish things off by going over some of my closing thoughts and also just flag some of the things that you need to sort of bear in mind when using ADF, some sort of notes from the field, things that I've come across when using it that may be quite useful if you're considering using it yourself. So a little bit about me. So I'm sort of director and co-founder of a small Microsoft Gold partner that's sort of based in Reading and Manchester. My background is covering Dynamics 365 mainly, also dipping my toes a lot into Power BI, Power Platform now, so things such as Power Apps and Power Automate, doing a lot of Azure as well. We've got a solution that we built out for the UK's water industry that's using a lot of these technologies underneath the hood. I'm also, for my sins, a Prince 2 project manager, practitioner, agile practitioner as well. So do a lot of management with projects and things like that. Certified Scrum Master as well, so therefore we can try and be truly agile. And I'm also involved as well as part of the Northwest Dynamics 365 user group based down in Manchester. We've got meetings happening fairly regularly now, so if you are interested in getting involved and want to attend a future event, then feel free to reach out to me using the details at the end and I can point you in the right direction. So the current landscape then when it comes to ETL with the Common Data Service. So we're quite well served when we think about it. There are quite a few different solutions that are available today that can help us achieve, whether it's very basic or perhaps even more complex data integration needs. So a common solution that people will generally use is something like Scribe Online. This provides a cloud-based solution that lets you connect up and import data, pull data out, import it into a separate location. So obviously the key benefits of that being it's a visual interface that you can do that with. It's also cloud-based, as I've said as well, which is obviously a big plus. For those looking for a bit more of a familiar experience, and by familiar I mean using tools such as SQL Server integration services, SQL Server data tools, things like that, you've got tools such as KingswaySoft that can plug in as part of that, so you can build out your entire integration process within a DTSX package and then plug in the appropriate bits from KingswaySoft to achieve that integration with Dynamics 365 or CDS. These days as well, you've got some really powerful capabilities within Power Query that allow you to basically grab data from multiple different sources. You can then use the Power Query editor to basically mend and shape that data. So that in itself is a very good solution, and one, if you're familiar working with Power BI, is definitely one that I would recommend that you do some experimentation with. And as you mentioned already, you've got SQL Server integration services as well, which can achieve, traditionally would achieve a lot of these sort of requirements. However, when we're sort of looking at all of these tools individually, I'm not too sure whether or not they can actually tick some of the boxes here that are on this slide. So for example, minimal cost investment. So certainly everything apart from the Power Query editor is going to cost you additional money on top for license fees or whatever it is. So potentially quite a big cost there. Having a fully cloud-based solution, so integration services is not a cloud-based solution. You're going to need some dedicated server infrastructure to run and host that. A key one for me, and it's something that we do a lot of now as a sort of small practice, is finding a solution that integrates really neatly with our DevOps processes. So what do I mean by that? I mean, so having the ability of being able to take your stuff, put it into source control really easily, being able to then build and test that automatically using CI or CD pipelines, and then also when it comes to deployment, again, being able to deploy those easily. Now, with tools such as SSIS, you can achieve the first of those quite easily. You can get your packages into source control. In my experience, doing anything when it comes to test deployments or releases or things like that of SSIS becomes quite complicated to implement. And then when we look at tools such as Typico Scribe or Power Query, again, it's very difficult for you to get that into source control. There's a few additional steps that you need as part of that. And then finally, find a solution that's really low code. So DTSX packages, do sort of provide that to a certain extent. Power Query, there's going to be quite a bit of fiddling around with either the Power Query editor or with M code to potentially get what you need on there. But really, it's about finding a solution that's ideally sort of low code, but you can also bolt on additional extensions where you need to, so whether that's custom code or things like that. So what I would potentially argue is that it's difficult for all these tools here to find a particular tool that ticks all the boxes here. So what you may end up doing is compromising. You implement a solution that's either too costly, one that's an absolute pig's ear to maintain. There's a very high physical a cost in terms of maintaining that solution, in terms of man hours, or one that maybe just doesn't fit neatly with your strategy. So if you've decided, for example, that you want to be purely Microsoft Cloud focused, Microsoft Azure focused, again, going down one of these other solutions, you might not be necessarily ticking that box. So these are some of the issues that you've got today with some of the other tools, and this is why I think potentially Azure Data Factory can be something that can fit the gap for certain situations. So it's been around now for about 4 years. Originally it came out, the first version, it was a bit like the Common Data Service. The first version was absolutely crap. Second one came along and a massive improvement. And it's what it's really built to do. It's designed to meet not just your simple data integration needs, so copy data from one database over to a cloud CRM system, for example, but it can start to achieve your more complex data integration needs. And really, I think how it's being positioned by Microsoft is it's really sort of seen as your SSIS killer. It's designed to achieve the same needs and objectives, but provide you with a much more modern and ultimately scalable solution that can sort of achieve your needs. The great thing as well is that it has got full support for SSIS and DTSX packages. It's really easy to take your packages, provision a dedicated compute environment in Azure Data Factory, and then you can then schedule and run your packages as if they're on-premise. And the benefit for that is that you can potentially achieve some cost efficiencies by moving it onto Azure compared to an on-premise infrastructure, for example. So, really powerful and scalable solution, and potentially one that supports you regardless of where you are in your sort of journey from a cloud adoption standpoint. So key features then. So it's really easy to use. It gives you a very nice, visual interface for you to develop your pipelines in, drag and drop. You've got a wide range of different activities and tasks that you can do. So for example, you can copy, we mentioned already being able to copy data from different sources. You can do things such as, for example, executing a stored procedure. You can perform web API requests to external REST endpoints or things like that. You can integrate it with solutions such as other solutions that are available, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. You've got a very wide array of capability as well. Another potential plus is that you don't necessarily have to burden yourself as well with downloading sort of complex, IDE tools such as Visual Studio. All of the development of the pipelines can be done within your browser. You can, of course, move that out into Visual Studio and develop it through there. All of the definitions for your pipelines and the structure of it is stored within JSON documents, so it's very easy for you to go in and manipulate that if you so choose. But generally, the online development environment will probably more than meet your expectations and needs. And now what you've got as well is, this was previously in preview until I think the back end of last year. You've now got what are called sort of data flows. So if you've come from a traditional SSIS background, you'll sort of know and be familiar with what data flows can do. It allows you to basically, okay, I want to take my data, I want to sort it, I want to filter it, I want to apply, a particular thing, I want to do a computed column, all this sort of good stuff. So previously this wasn't actually available in Data Factory. Now we've got this full functionality available. So really what we can start to argue now is that you've got the complete feature parity with SSIS, which is really crucial if you're considering wanting to move your workloads from on-premise integration services onto Azure Data Factory. Moving on then, in terms of what other benefits that it can deliver, then you've got really wide integration across the stack. So not only can you connect to a wide array of different Microsoft sort of data sources, so whether it's storage accounts, Azure SQL database, Azure Data Lakes, things like that. You've also got support for other connectors as well, including non-Microsoft ones. So you can, for example, connect to things such as SAP, Salesforce, etc. And the good thing as well for purposes of today's talk is that you've got full support for not only online Dynamics 365 but also on-premise as well. So provided that it's an internet-facing deployment, you can connect up to it as if it was the available online, which is obviously a really major plus. Other things that you can leverage across the sort of the Azure stack. So I mentioned a few of these already. So you've got Azure Databricks. So that's for when you want to do sort of very highly bespoke modifications and tailoring for your data. Azure Functions. So if you wanted to execute sort of a bit of code, a bit of C# code or PowerShell code for your data as it's being pushed through, you can do that. Machine learning integration as well. All of this can be sort of natively integrated with as part of your Azure Data Factory pipelines. As you mentioned already as well, you've got the full ability to be able to lift and shift your SSIS packages into the cloud. So really, and that can really streamline your adoption of that as well. So moving on, and for me, probably the best thing about Azure Data Factory is the full DevOps integration that it provides you. So previously you don't have to necessarily worry about going to spending massive effort to get your pipelines, your JSON definitions that I mentioned earlier into source control. With a click of a button, you can link up your data factory to your source control provider, whether it's GitHub or Azure DevOps, and as you're making changes to your pipeline, that is automatically committed into your repository. In addition to that as well, what you can also do is within the data factory interface, you can create your branches and pull requests, with a few clicks of a button that will then open up and create accordingly. And when you've finished and developed everything, the data factory can either manually or automatically spit out a complete Azure Resource Manager template, which you can then use as part of a deployment, an Azure Pipelines deployment, to get that automatically pushed out. So all of these are huge ticks, and really, if you're wanting to sort of have a really slick process in terms of development, to test, to release, etc., this is the tool for you because it achieves it all in a really, really nice way. And finally as well, from a pricing standpoint, it's nothing really to be sort of snuffed at really. So you're charged based on how much you use it, basically. So it's all modeled after the sort of the Azure type cost model. You only pay for what you use as part of that. So really, if you've got, let's say, a single pipeline or a package that's running, let's say, once a day, then potentially this is only going to cost you maybe the price of a few cups of coffee each month to run and execute. And certainly for one-off type imports or activities, so let's say you're doing just a one-off data migration into Dynamics 365, it's not going to cost you that much at all, apart from the setup time, obviously, in terms of building it out and things like that. And again, mentioned this already, but certainly if you've got SSIS workloads that are being run on premise at the moment, then there's certainly a really good argument to at least consider moving it onto Azure Data Factory. There's a lot of savings that you can realise as part of that, by sort of lifting and shifting your existing workloads, or in situations where you can't redevelop your packages to into an Azure Data Factory pipeline, you can just upload your packages and run them as if they were on premise, which is obviously a really big bonus. Okay, so best way I think to obviously see Data Factory is to sort of see it in action. So we're going to look at a sort of an example scenario today that hopefully shows you the range of different features that are available and the stuff that I've talked about so far as well. So the scenario is that we've got our organisation, call it what you will, Contoso, AdventureWorks, whatever name you want, and we're currently wanting to migrate from Dynamics CRM 2013 on-premise to the latest version of Dynamics 365 Online, so version 9. So as part of this, we've identified the following entities that we want to migrate across as part of it. And what we want to do is we want to perform some element of transformation and modification to the data as it's being read and fed through. So for example, for an account name, we want to just do some manipulation to the data itself. We want to append a specific value to the end of the name that gives us a visual cue straight away in terms of what the size of the organisation is. So for example, if it's under 50 employees, then we append -SMB to the end of it. For the contact fields, because we're feeling very GDPR conscious these days, we want to make sure that we append the appropriate contact preferences onto each contact record to ensure that we block all contact except via email by default. And then finally, because we don't really care about our prospect or sales data that's we're not currently working with, we only want to import open leads that are in an open state only. into our online instance, just so we can make sure we're not putting a load of rubbish into the database potentially. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to do this entire migration in 15 minutes or less, and what this will hopefully demonstrate and prove is just how fast and how effective pipelines are when it comes to processing your data at scale. So in terms of the technology that we're using today, so obviously it'd be a really rubbish demo if we weren't using Data Factory as part of this. What we're also doing is, so we're importing this data into our CDS database, which is indicated on the bottom there. We're also doing a little bit of Power Automate flow magic behind the scenes just to get some of the data into the correct locations and fields. I'll talk about why that's required at the end, but it's basically just taking data in one field and then just importing it into another field just to make sure. That's due to some of the limitations that we've got with Data Factory at the moment. For the data, what we're doing, first of all, we're loading it into a staging area into Azure. So in this case, our staging area is a storage account with a container. So we're just going to extract the data, pop it into CSV format and save it into storage account. We're using Azure Key Vault as well. Azure Key Vault is a really great solution. So if you're working with secure credentials, so passwords, connection strings, things like that, what you can do is you can store those in Azure Key Vault and grant permissions only for Data Factory to read that information. So effectively what you're doing as part of this, you're not storing secure credentials in plain text, which is obviously a big no-no from a security standpoint. So we're using Azure Key Vault to basically handle the management of our credentials in a secure manner. And then finally, we've got an Azure VM, which is running Hyper-V, and our CRM 2013 instance, which we're going to go on and take a look at first of all before we crack on. Okay, so with all that done, let's jump in and let's take a look at Azure Data Factory in detail. Okay, so we've jumped across now to the Hyper-V machine that I mentioned just a moment ago. And at the moment we've got our dynamic CRM 2013 instance all open, so this might look familiar to some people from working with this many years ago. If we go across to the accounts entity first of all, we should be able to see that we've got a fair few records in here that we want to get moved across. It might just take a few moments because the Hyper-V is not the most fastest in the world. Whilst we're waiting for that then, so essentially when it comes to Data Factory then it exists as a resource in Azure, so you have to go to the portal.azure.com, you go into there, you create your resource. The actual authoring and the sort of management of the Data Factory is done via a separate interface. So to get to that, you click on the author and monitor tab over here, and then this pops us out onto here, and this is basically the Data Factory interface on here. So you get greeted with a home screen first of all, with some useful links and videos to various tutorials. The main body of work actually goes on in the author area of the application here with the pencil icon, and we can jump across to here and see what we've got built out on here. So within here we've got our full experience, our full designer ready to experience. We can go onto here, we can click onto the various different components that we've got set up. So the key component behind Data Factory is this pipeline, and this can be best thought of as your package, or from in the SSIS world, it basically is the steps for your data integration package. What are you telling it to do? And it's built up of various different activities that you define on there, and you've got a handy sort of toolbox here of the most common ones that you can sort of see. And these can be sort of dragged and dropped onto the interface at any particular point. You can create, define, okay, which order they execute in, things like that, which is really good. Other components that you've got on here, so we've got the various data sets defined, both for our on-premise SQL database on here. So because the CRM instance we're working with is not internet facing, we're going in via the database instead, which is obviously perfectly allowed, I believe, as long as you're querying the filtered views. And then we've got the links to our various CDS entities down here, and then the blob storage accounts as well, which we use and connect to in order to transform the data. We've got our data flows down here, which we'll dive into a little bit more detail shortly. And then connections over here, so we've got the various connections defined, so on-premise SQL, as I mentioned, CDS, our Key Vault resource on there. And then the bit that's actually doing the connection to our on-premise SQL database is our self-hosted integration runtime. So if we jump across to our machine down here, so this is our CRM machine running Windows Server 2008, we can see on here we've got our integration runtime set up on here. So in the Power Platform world, you've got the on-premise gateway, which is a separate application, but it sort of works on a similar basis as the integration runtime. It lets you connect to your on-premise data sources as if they were available on cloud. So you install this out onto the machine that you want to connect up to, and from there it can then route through and basically process any data on there, whether it's a SQL database, DB2, Oracle, whatever it is on premise. Okay, so it looks as if our CRM window's loaded up here. So we can see at the moment we've got in here our iActive accounts view. We've got all these different random account records in here, nearly 4,000 in total. If we jump across to our the online CRM instance that we're going to be copying the data to, we click on the accounts view over here, we can see we've got no data in here at the moment. So we need to fix that. We need to get our data moved into there. So we're going to jump back to Data Factory now. We're going to jump to this pipeline on here. So this is basically our master pipeline that executes the following 3 pipelines on here for each of the separate entities that we want to import into. So first of all, I'm just going to click debug, and I'm just going to kick this off. And what we're going to do is we're going to let's click here on debug. Now what we're going to do is we're going to just kick off the pipeline, and I'm going to go in and just sort of explain in detail what it's doing. And hopefully by the time it's finished all that, everything's been fully executed and imported, and we're all good. So as I mentioned, it executes each individual pipeline down here in detail. So if we jump into one of those, the account one, we can sort of see what's going on in a bit more detail. So first of all, we've got a copy data activity. So what this does is it copies our data, literally, from the on-premise SQL database. We can see down here. So we've got a query defined that gets the data out for us. If we were to jump to our little SQL machine down here, we can actually execute the query that's that actually runs on the Data Factory. If we just give SSIS a moment just to come to life. Okay, so if we run this query now, we can basically see precisely which data we're going to be grabbing up. It might just take a minute just to finish running that. So yeah, so we can see on there 3,840 records, and it's mostly just your common fields on there, and a mixture of different data types as well. So you've got your option set fields, you've got your normal string fields, a few numeric fields and things like that. Okay, so we copy that first of all to a blob storage location into a CSV format. This then lets us modify the data further. We then kick off a mapping data flow. So what is a mapping data flow? So if we jump across onto here, we can actually view the properties of it in detail. And what this is, it gives you the ability of being able to execute various different transformation steps against your data. So what we've defined here is first of all our CSV file. We want to get the data from our CSV file. We then do a derived column step on here, and based on the requirements that we've done earlier, what we want to do is we want to take the existing name field and we want to append on a new value based on a sort of simple logic on here. So if we click on the column down here, we can actually expand the editor window down here, and we can see, okay, here's the expression that we want to execute over here. So it's just a very simple if statement to run that. So again, if you're familiar with working with SSIS, working with expressions in SSIS, this whole editor and visual experience should be very familiar to you, and you've got the same type of functions available as well, which is really nice. Makes it very easy for you to get running with this and do some quite powerful things as well. So in this case, we append on our new account name value. We then kick off spit out the new file as a new CSV file back into our blob storage location on here, and then from there we can then process it further from here. If we wanted to, we could add on additional steps as part of our pattern on here. Just by clicking on the plus icon on here, we can see, okay, what other steps we've got available on here. So we've got the ability of being able to do our joins, we can do unions, we can look up a particular value, we've got the ability of doing, just select specific fields, pivot our data, filter it, maybe even alter specific row based on some logic as well. So very powerful functionality on here. Previously, what you would have to do to achieve this, you'd have to create an Azure Databricks, use a Python script to do these sort of steps, and that's very potentially quite complicated and convoluted to do that. Mapping data flows uses the same functionality behind the scenes, but we don't get to see that. All we're concerned about is just building out our steps using familiar common type activities to be able to do that, and then that way we can just focus more on actually getting our data transformed as opposed to going through sort of massive, doing a load of needless work. Okay, so if we jump back onto our accounts pipeline now then, so as I mentioned, we spit out our CSV file into the blob storage account again. So this stage here picks it up on here. As part of spitting the file name out, we append on the current date just to give us just to ensure each file name is unique. So we've got a wildcard filter on here to make sure that we always grab the correct file. And then our sync data source is our CDS account entity over here. And what we've done on here, we've mapped across each of the individual fields from our data source down here, and it automatically detects our various data types as part of that, which is really nice. And then we specify, okay, which fields in CRM we want to add those on. We do have to specify those manually. Unfortunately, the import schemas button is a little bit flaky. It doesn't grab precisely what fields that we sort of want, or intelligently detect which fields we want to grab. So we have to sort of do that instead, which is a little bit unfortunate. So finally, once the import's been fully completed, we then just have a final step where we sort of say, okay, we want to keep things tidy in our blob storage account. So go in there and just delete any file that's been put into there. You perhaps maybe for a live scenario, maybe just do a more specific wildcard instead of just a generic, okay, delete everything in there. But just for the purpose of this demo, you can see you've got the, just got to do everything on there. So each of the other pipelines basically work on the same sort of principle, as you can see here, same sort of steps, but with the data flow steps just ever so slightly different. So if we click on the contact transform one, we can see again on this one, okay, we do another derived column activity on this as well, but with a slightly different step here. We're just saying, okay, we want to append on the contact preferences field, and we just give it a very specific value as part of that. And then finally, the lead transform one. We use the filter setting on here as well, and we just sort of say we only want leads where the state code equals 0, which is basically ones that are active. Okay, and then yeah, so that's all that does on there. So you've got quite a lot of ability on there to be able to do quite some interesting things. If we jump back to our master pipeline now, let's see where it's up to. Okay, so just at the moment it's about 6 minutes through for processing the lead entity at the moment. So while we're waiting, then we can take a close look in terms of some of the activities that we've got available to us at a pipeline level. So the copy data one, which we've seen already, does exactly what it says on the tin. We'll discuss the data flow as well. We've got the ability of being able to integrate and run an Azure Data Explorer command. We can call an Azure function from our pipeline. We've got the ability of being able to run custom commands as well. So based on command line syntax, we can run that. As I mentioned earlier, we can kick things out into Azure Databricks and execute a notebook or a particular Python script as part of that. We integrate with SQL, which is quite nice. We've got some general functions down here, so you've got the ability of in pipelines to work with variables. You can add a variable onto the pipeline, you can set its value, retrieve it from another location. The ability to execute an SSIS package, so you would set up your, you can upload your packages and then run them as part of a pipeline, which could be quite handy. Being able to perform lookups, execute stored procedures, validate that a data source actually exists before you execute any logic, that could be quite useful. Being able to execute web commands either via an API call or webhook, and even wait conditions as well. You can integrate with tools such as Spark and Hive, which is quite nice. You can also do iteration conditionals as well, so you can do a for each, so for each value in a row it executes some specific functionality. You can do if conditions as well, which is really nice. Switch and until, and then also you can also call out machine learning, Azure machine learning activities as well, which is quite nice. So if we jump back to our connections, then we can take just a little bit closer detail in terms of the actual connections that you can actually set up as part of a pipeline. So as you can see on here, you've got a whole variety of different link services that you can connect up to. So you've got your common Microsoft ones, so Azure Database for MySQL, Azure Data Lake and things like that, but also Amazon S3 storage, Amazon Redshift, all these different apps down here, Concur, which is in preview at the moment. It's worth mentioning that you've got several different connectors for Dynamics 365, Common Data Service for Apps, Dynamics 365 and Dynamics CRM. They're all essentially the same. They all use the same, they all have the same properties that are defined for them, the same options. So interestingly, for example, for Common Data Service, you've actually got the option of being able to specify an on-premise with IFD for the Common Data Service, which technically speaking doesn't exist, but we won't dwell too much on that. But essentially they all operate and act the same. General recommendation probably is, okay, for anything that's targeting online, just use the Common Data Service for Apps connector. And then for, if it's an on-premise, Dynamics CRM 2013 or the latest version, Dynamics 365 version 9, then use the appropriate connector for that. But generally, Common Data Service for Apps connector will probably see you through on that. Then once it's sort of defined on there, it becomes available. You can then sort of go into your data source down here and just create an additional new data set that's mapped across to your particular entity. So if I wanted to do, let's say, a new common data service wrapped entity, just press continue on there, go to connection. If I make sure I select my link service first of all, okay, it doesn't appear to be working for some reason. Okay, because I've not defined it as a, the source I'm using is defined as a Dynamics 365 one, so I have to make sure I'm using the appropriate one for that. So in which case then, if we shift that across to Dynamics 365, go to connection on here, yep, there we go, we can see that on there. Now I can then just quickly refresh, I can get all the list of all the entities that are in our particular instances on here, and then just select the particular one that I want to map to, which is really nice. We won't save that for now. Okay, let's see how our pipeline's doing at this particular point then. Where's it gone? Data migration. Okay, so we can see that it's just about finished processing the account one. We'll let this finish now for the particular contact records, but if we were to jump across into Dynamics 365 now, give this view here a little refresh, we should be able to see all of our account records have been copied across successfully. And we can see as well for the account name, the appropriate value has been appended onto there as well. So we can click here and view the record in a bit more detail. All of the field values that we specified for an on-premise database have been successfully moved across, which is really nice. We can see on there that there's been no problems there parsing the data, or even indeed, or any other issues around that. Because we're limited to a certain degree in terms of how we perform record assignments, by default the records are owned by the person who you've authenticated with through Data Factory, so in this case my own user account. So typically what you'd probably want to do is set up a dedicated service account and import data in through that way. If we check the leads tab now, we should see that we've got a number of leads on there as well. If we were to filter this out, we should be able to confirm that, yeah, we've got all of the open leads only on there. We've not got any other lead, closed lead that's been moved across on there as well. Check on here. Hopefully by now the final one is just about close to be completing. We might be able to see the records coming through if we go into this view on here. Yeah, we can see at the moment we've got 3,845 and rising at the moment. So again, it's importing all these records in just fine. If I was to click on Lordan and Sears over here, we should be able to view his contact preferences and confirm that's all been applied correctly. I think it's under the details tab now. Yeah, we can see, okay, we've allowed the email, but we don't want to allow phone, fax, mail, etc. for his contact preferences. So that should be close to finishing up now. But the really great thing about this is the ability to debug and run, test things really quickly. And we've got the ability of being able to view details of each sort of executed sort of stage as well. So we can see on here our input parameters on here, what settings have gone into to trigger off the pipeline, and ultimately what the sort of the success is for that and the code for that. So what we can do is if we go to the account one, we should be able to click on here and we can actually view in detail the each step that it's run as part of this. So we can see that, okay, it's gone in there, it's run that particular query, it's written those files out into our blob storage location without any issues on there. It's run our pipeline over there. We can actually click on the little icon on here and we can visually see how each step has been executed, including the amount of time that it's taken to process that. This can be really handy in terms of just diagnosing, just making sure that everything's running very smoothly. Close that down for now. Then we've got our copy across onto there again. Because we're copying into Dynamics, we get a much nicer visual view on here, so we can actually see the amount of rows read, the amount of rows written into the application, the amount of throughput, the size of the data that's been written, which is quite interesting, and also the fact that it's taken less than a minute to copy this across, which obviously is really quite fast as well, potentially. Really fast ingestion speeds. At the end of it all, it's basically gone in there and it's removed our storage account as well, which is really nice. So by now it's hopefully all finished, and yeah, we can see it's all finished, so that's really nice. So a couple of things just to basically just point out when you're working with Data Factory, particularly on the DevOps side of things. We can see at the moment this particular Data Factory is linked up to a Git repository on Azure DevOps, and I can see at the moment I'm actually in the master branch. So as I mentioned earlier, it will retrieve all the different branches that you've got defined out on here. So you've got a few here that I've done for various different purposes down here. I can very easily create a new branch just by going in there, defining a name for it and things like that. Then when it comes to doing a pull request to get the data into there, I can click that button on there. It's then going to go out into Azure DevOps. I can then populate my pull request on there and add comments, review, share it out to other people. It gives you the ability of being able to integrate really nicely with the tools that developers these days are most familiar working with. A couple of things just to point out as well. So typically what you would do, instead of running pipelines manually, you define a trigger for that. So you go in here and basically say, okay, every, let's say, 1 minute or 1 week, I want to run this package at this particular day, at this particular time. So you can define that all in there. Then for ongoing maintenance and management, you've got the view on here that shows you, okay, here are all the different runs that have been sort of executed over the past sort of 24 hours. You can modify those different settings on there, get a much longer view of the data if you so need to. Because we've been running all our pipelines in debug mode, they won't appear in here. Unfortunately, it's only ones that have been sort of triggered via a sort of schedule that you've defined down here. So that's pretty much it, I guess, in terms of things to sort of show you with Data Factory. As we can see, it's been really quick. We've been able to get all the data in there in, let's have a look at the precise time. So just under 15 minutes, 12, 13 minutes. So that's really quite fast. And really the main amount of time here has actually been in terms of just actually spinning up our debug environment. There's been 3 minutes that have been potentially added on there in terms of spinning that up. So as you can see, really quick to sort of provision, set up and execute. Really powerful in terms of the features and functionality that you've got on there. And something that potentially could be quite useful if you're considering some kind of integration involving Dynamics 365 or the Common Data Service. Alright, so with the demo complete, then hopefully you've got a good indication now in terms of what you can do with Data Factory, and how easy it is to sort of get it working, to meet any potential integration needs. So before we sort of wrap things up, there's just a few things that I wanted just to mention, things just sort of keep in mind if you're finding your feet with Data Factory for the first time. So I mentioned earlier about the need of having a sort of Power Automate flow behind the scenes to sort of do a bit of magic. So this is needed because currently the sink, i.e. the destination data source for Dynamics 365 CDS doesn't support the following data types that are listed on this slide here. So you can't, for example, import into the owner field, and you can't import into the customer field. So what the flow is doing behind the scenes is it's importing data into a sort of a temporary field and then mapping that across accordingly based on what record it is. I think at the moment this limitation is here because there's no way in which you can so for these fields, there's no way in Data Factory that you can tell it, okay, which entity does this particular record belong to as you're mapping to it. Hopefully it's something they'll fix in the future, because it will be quite nice for us to potentially import data into these fields, so we're not having to perform a manual record assignment or having to perform record associations for the customer field after things have been imported. So just keep that in mind. Bear in mind that you might need to just do some additional manipulation. So in our case, we've done a Power Automate flow. You could, for example, look at a plugin or maybe do a web API request after the pipeline's run to perform any record assignments. So it's not impossible to achieve. It's just something that you just need to bear in mind. Other things to sort of think about is that at the moment you can only import data into Dynamics 365 concurrently for up to 2 pipelines. I think this is a platform limitation for Dynamics 365 and CDS, so you can't have multiple connections doing stuff via the sort of the DO-Data endpoint and things like that at the same time. So just keep that in mind. Don't be executing 3 pipelines to run at the same time. Otherwise, you're probably going to get potential errors. You'll have to also, one thing to keep in mind as well is you'll have to do some work around building out the field mappings from your source data set, whether it's SQL or something else, into Dynamics 365. When you try and import the schema automatically, it just seems to bring in just a jumble of random fields So not even without any sort of logic around it, not it always seems to be different based on my experience. So what you would have to potentially going to have to factor in and do is manually defining your schema, particularly if you're working with a lot of custom fields as well. You're going to have to go in and manually type in the logical names for each of those fields, map them across accordingly. Just keep that in mind. There will be some work and effort there as part of that. And what I will say is that if you're not coming from an SSIS background, like myself, for example, then the potential the learning curve for the solution is going to be a lot higher, particularly when you compare it to something like Scribe Online, which is really an easy tool for potentially for even BA type users, business analyst users, or power users to get to grips with really easily. Something like this, okay, yeah, you've got the drag and drop interface, you can sort of figure out your way a little bit, but it's going to be a bit of a learning curve. So just keep that in mind. If you've not come from an SSIS background, then this is something that's going to be you're going to have to probably devote some additional time to get in your head around how Data Factory works. So in closing, then, we mentioned earlier, how the sort of the journey and history behind Data Factory. So now we're in version 2. Version 2 just seems to be where things get better. Whether it's for Common Data Service or Azure Data Factory, we're now in a position with Data Factory where it's a really great solution. It's matured considerably. It's added in some of the missing features such as data flows. And it's really I would probably argue your go-to tool if you're wanting to achieve any sort of data integration needs and not wanting to necessarily saddle yourself with the burden of deploying out SSIS on-premise or things like that. So certainly, for example, in our case, as a business organization, we're using Data Factory purely now for any data integration needs, and really there has to be a good business or technical reason for us to use SSIS for us if we're going to seriously consider it. Part of the reason for this is that because of the really great Devils experience, we can really easily integrate this with the tools that we're using, such as Azure DevOps. We can get the stuff released a lot faster. We can automate a lot of our testing and deployments and things like that. It's a much far nicer experience, and I really doubt that you can achieve that with tools such as SSIS these days. And ultimately, for those who are feeling particularly cost conscious, this is not going to break the piggy bank. For one-off type jobs, for maybe pipelines they're executing maybe once per day or things like that, it's not going to cost you an arm and a leg, and you're only ultimately paying for what you're using. So really, it's good. So I think it ticks that box as well, whilst also providing you with almost enterprise-like scalability, and a range of different features, in the process. So really, what I would say is, for the DevOps conscious, for the wallet conscious as well, Data Factory is really something that I would recommend you look at, because it's gonna tick both of those boxes straight away. So I appreciate that today we've looked at a sort of demo scenario. We tried to cover it at a really high level. So what I've done is everything that we've looked at today, the whole entire solution, I've put onto my GitHub page. So you can use the link here on the slide to get onto there, or the QR code. And what you can do within there, you can see the solution in sort of detail. Fiddle about with it, change it about, and obviously deploy it out into your own environment to give it a bit more testing as well. So hopefully that'll be useful if you're looking at Data Factory for the first time. So I hope this has been really useful today. It's given you a good flavour for what Data Factory can achieve. My contact details are on the slide on here, so feel free to reach out to me if you've got any queries. Other than that, thanks for listening. If you're enjoying the content on the channel so far, make sure you subscribe. Plenty of videos coming out at the moment, whether it's to do with this or my MB400 exam series that's worth checking out. So feel free to stick around, and yeah, thank you very much. Take care.